Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Biblical Rogues Gallery, and we can still say rogues even though there's only two of us because that's plural. So,
yes.
How you doing, Amber?
Technically, I'm really, I think, in the same position as the question that we're answering here. I have no clue because it's been a very weird day after a very weird weekend, and I'm a little cranky that nobody else showed up. Where are the rest of these losers?
Oh, I'm absolutely not, because it just leaves more air for us to suck out of the room without all them interrupting. So I'm actually kind of excited about this because I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm like you. I'm like, well, I have my leanings, but this issue seems to be important to a lot of people, not me. But this is one of those exegetical decisions that, I mean, I can live with being. Some of these are ridiculous. We're going to go through all of the options for verse 26. Trust me, we'll get there. But I mean, however that goes, however you answer this question, I know that we phrase "has the church replaced Israel" simply for clickbait. Replacement theology. Some people just own the term because they're like, I don't care what you think about it. Others say no, it's more of ingrafting, or it's more of a whatever. So however you want to say it, though, supposedly replacement theology is a pejorative, and that's over and against all the people that think Israel is always and only ethnic or national Israel. So that's, for some people, this is a hill to die on, and it's interesting at this time, considering what's going on X, formerly Twitter. I have noticed a lot of discussion about how certain Christians feel about Jews, and it's kind of ugly. What's all out
How
there.
about disgusting?
Yeah. And so, there's a lot of things going on about that. I've weighed into it in my usual manner, which is to get on everyone's nerves, of course, but yeah, we did a video on Trinity Radio asking what's up with all that and why do all the Calvinists hate James White now, which, I mean, I think he's doing the Lord's work with that. But anyway, yeah, so Romans 11:25 through 36, we're going to finally finish the chapter. Yes, Mind Warden says, where are the laser-eyed Theo bros in the chat? Yeah. They're coming to get mad at me, probably. Well, probably not. I don't know.
They'll probably get mad at me, I'm sure.
Comments in a week when they catch you. Nobody pays attention to me anyway. Matt G says, I was a dispy for 20, not for the last 15. This subject is near to me. I kind of defaulted dispensationalist because I came up in the John MacArthur West Coast Calvispensationalist tradition, as I like to call it. He's been in the news lately, but I was actually a member of Steve Lawson's church at the Bible Church of Little Rock when he was there before he went to Dolphin Way Baptist Church, shrunk that, and then moved down the road. And then, of course, we all know what's happened since then. But yeah, so that was kind of my wheelhouse, and I kind of left Calvinism and dispensationalism and cessationism and complementary, all of the things that they represented, I've seemed to have left. So I'm just not buying that stuff anymore, but that's fine. Not Chat GPT, but Grok says that I'm a reformed complementarian when I told it to give me this little button on my profile, and you can do it on anyone's profile to give you a summary. It says, so in one sense, I don't know if it means I'm a reformed as in theology complementarian, or if it means I'm a reformed complementarian, means I'm no longer one. You can go either way. So, but that's what Chat or Grok 2 thinks about me, and thinks that I handle religious and political discussions with sarcasm, which is absolutely true. Yes. Get out of town, not Pritchett.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Right.
Oh. Well, Grok told me that I like to argue with people, so I doubt the validity of Grok at this point.
Yeah, namely me. Let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
I will read tonight Romans 11, 25 through 36 from the New American Standard Bible.
Ugh.
For I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. And in this way, all Israel, as some kind of more literal, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. In relation to the gospel, they are enemies on your account. But in relation to God's choice or election, they are beloved on account of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may show mercy to all. Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and unfathomable are his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who has first given to him that it would be paid back to him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So, when I look at this, I see that over and above all things is before he goes into his first of a couple of kind of hymnic doxologies in Romans. He is kind of like, you don't know when to quit, bro, but no, it's great. Mercy continues the theme that he's been on about. Since the beginning of the book, really. But I mean, through this section of Romans 9 through 11, and especially 11, the focus seems to be overwhelmingly on mercy. So I still have that in mind. Whatever the smaller exegetical choices people make here, keeping the eye on the ball, that what God is doing, as he kind of, we talked about in the last episode of kind of his purposes of cutting off branches and bringing, grafting other branches in, and all of that is this is still God's program of redemption at play, with the overwhelming focus on mercy in light of human disobedience. So whatever else we want to make of this, in the smaller picture, what I still see is Paul rejoicing over the mercy of God for both Jews and Gentiles. So I think keeping that big picture in our minds as we go through what the little details of this passage are is kind of important. What do you think? I think you're muted. People prefer it when I'm muted. They don't prefer it when you're muted.
I think they might prefer if I'm muted today. I think, this is one of those places where get lost in looking at the bark on the trees. We don't even get to the trees. We're just looking at bark on trees, and we completely miss the forest. And I think this is gets us into the territory of asking the wrong question. So let's look at the wrong questions and figure it out.
Yeah. So, well, at least you have to like this better than the last episode, because we're back to Old Testament stuff coming in. And in fact, in the very first verse, we've got, this echo of Proverbs 3, verse 7. And I will read that for this, this wise in their own estimation stuff, kind of echoes that language of Proverbs 3. Let me pull that up. I'll read the whole thing.
The entire chapter 3?
Yeah, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7. That
Proverbs.
language, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. So this is kind of one of those allusions or echoes or whatever that he's trying to use this phraseology to put that in their mind.
Right.
it goes back to the warning from the previous episode that we were talking about, don't be arrogant. But now he's kind of continuing up on that. He doesn't want them to be ignorant, of this mystery. And this mystery thing is kind of interesting because, like, people talk about mysterion, is this it was previously hidden but now revealed, and we hear a lot of people talk about when the language of mystery, but they don't really go into it further than that. They just kind of they kind of have to default with that without getting into the mystery religions of the pagans and all of that other stuff. But what's really at play here is, it's once hidden and now revealed. But the thing that often gets left out is that this is supposed to be insider knowledge, not outsider knowledge. So Paul is saying, I want you to understand this mystery. And scholars debate where Paul got this information from. People could say, well, he found it implicitly buried in his reworking of the Old Testament, or he got this as direct revelation from God, or some combination thereof, but they can't root it down. But he's trying to, the way he sets this up, the way he kind of drops this idea, I don't want you to be ignorant and, don't try to be wise in your own estimation, is this idea that, contrary to like some of the mystery pagan ideas, where that are like proto-Gnostics, where this kind of knowledge, having this kind of insider info, would puff you up. He's trying to continue to peg them down while he does this. So while you can point out this kind of similarity with other ideas in Paul's day about mysteries, you have to note the difference. And the difference is, instead of this kind of hidden insider info puffing you up, because he has a lot to say about that in the Corinthians correspondence, he said, I don't want don't think that you're wise, don't think any of this, but I want you to know this. I want you to be appraised of this. I don't want you to be ignorant of it, but don't also think you're wise in your own estimation about this partial hardening that's come to Israel. So I like the fact that he kind of loops that just proverbial nugget of wisdom into the way that he opens this up, because he says this partial hardening of Israel, because obviously it can't be a total hardening, because he uses himself as an example, earlier in this section. I too am an Israelite, right. So we've got that kind of going on. But there's a partial hardening till the fullness of Gentiles come in. And that what is going on kind of echoes back to what we talked about last week. All this is happening. This hardening for Israel is for your good. So what do you make of this fullness of Gentiles, this partial hardening into the fullness of Gentiles? How do you understand all of what's going on here in verse 25?
Verse 25. Well, I was just looking at this agneod there. Agneo. I don't know. I haven't taken Greek in a really long time, so it takes me a little longer to figure this out. But this sounds to me like he's repeating the message of the point of one of the points of Jonah, of don't miss the point. Like, part of this satire in the language in the book of Jonah is to confront Israel with why they're so hard-hearted, that Jonah goes and gives the worst sermon ever to Nineveh, and they're on their knees and ashes and repenting and fasting at, as like 9 words or whatever it was, it's written down. And Israel at that point has had over half of the prophets. So they're so, hard-hearted and refuse to listen to God. And they're, to me, that feels like a mirror that he's holding up, that same mirror that we're getting with Jonah. Like, why are you being so, intentionally ignorant? It's like you're not recognizing that this mystery's been revealed to you. That's kind of that's what I see. I mean,
to me, it seems like I don't know if it seems like he's trying to see. That's an interesting question, because the earlier diatribe was you might get big headed about all this, and so I don't want you to do that, or God's going to cut off. He could cut you branches off, So maybe some of that, but at the same time, it seems like he's giving them knowledge about. I mean, obviously, this all has a purpose of uniting the tensions between the Jewish congregations and Gentile congregations in Rome, and so it seems to me that he has his eyes on Spain, and so he's got this fullness of Gentiles. So to me, I don't know if that's so much of why don't you already know this so much as, hey, maybe this is. Would it not be more of an ingratiation to Paul to say, hey, let me let you in on this insider info? It may be more that than necessarily that the Gentiles are. I mean, the Gentiles are obviously hardened towards the Jews, because we're going to get into that in the later chapters where he's trying to sort out their animosities. But it seems like this mystery language here is, and because scholars are divided on, it doesn't seem like this once hidden, now revealed insider knowledge. There's a lot of different debates in the commentaries of where he could have gotten this knowledge, if it was rather directly from God, or he found it some sort of hermeneutic from scripture combination. So I don't know. It could be.
I think there's also echoes of Abraham and Genesis 15 here, in the fullness of the Gentiles, and bringing everyone in through that in Israel that there's partially been hardened because of their own stubbornness. So if you're going to be if you're not wise, that means there's like stupid stubbornness, kind of a, aspect to that, an intentional.
Sure. It goes back to chapter 9, where Paul has placed unbelieving Israel into the role of Pharaoh. This is similar language here,
Yeah.
It says, their unbelief is what did this, but it's good for you until the fullness of Gentiles comes in. And of course, that's debated. Does Paul mean here, like, the total sum of every individual Gentile that will ever come to Christ? Or is it more corporate language of the fullness of Gentiles, meaning representatives from each of the different Gentile territories or nations or whatever? And so there's a lot of discussion about that.
Well, I think if we keep going and add in 26 and 27, we kind of need those three together, because you've got that quote there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the big question, though.
That's Isaiah 59.
Until the fullness of Gentiles comes in, and so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. And the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. Now, when it talks about all of this happening, and when the fullness of Gentiles comes in, the implication, I think, is that the partial hardening will be lifted, and then in this way, all Israel will be saved. And of course, the big question that everyone wants answered that's watching this podcast is, does it mean ethnic Israel? And within ethnic Israel, you have three options. Only the remnant, going back to 9:6, however you understand the Israel within Israel, is all Israel's remnant. Is it a giant come to Jesus of all ethnic Israel at the eschaton? There's even views out there that says this will be all Israel, past, present, and future, because of how they understand God's promises. So that there's a couple of scholars out there making that case, but it's the least popular. But the two most popular it is ethnic Israel, but it's either just the remnant, or it's all ethnic Israel at the second coming, the parousia of Jesus. So it's either that, and that doesn't necessarily mean all without exception, but just kind of majority or a large, but Jewett actually rejects that. He says Poss doesn't leave that opportunity open for anybody. He disagrees with the larger majority of scholars that go with that it's all Israel means ethnic Israel, but a large number, but not all without exception. And he says, no, that's not available to you. This is going to be like some sort of universal acceptance of all Israel whenever this takes place, which I don't know that that's necessary. I mean, but that's never been the case. So I don't know why that would have to be the case. And what does saved here mean? Does it mean saved by the gospel at some point in the future? Does it mean that they're going to be saved over the course of human history? And if it's only ethnic Israel instead of the Jew plus Gentile church, which is your other option, if only ethnic Israel, is that by God himself, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, independent of conscious faith in Christ, which is also a claim that's made, and that goes back to the Isaiah reference. The deliverer will come from Zion, which is interesting because I think that's instead of the deliverer will go to Zion, to kind of rephrasement here, deliver from Zion and remove the ungodliness from Jacob. So this breaks down how you understand deliverer, how you understand Zion. Who is Jacob? Who's this? It's just like you've got to answer all of these questions,
right?
Probably more questions than the audience might have been prepared for. When you want to say, well, is Paul talking about in this way all Israel, meaning the Jew plus Gentile that was grafted into the Israel tree of the olive, or is he just meaning Israel like they'll assert he's always meant Israel all through 9, 10, and 11? But even if it's that, how does that happen and when? So you've got all of these things to untangle.
I think there's a lot of assumed knowledge on Paul's part here that he didn't tell us, that he just left out, and that would have been helpful.
But the question is
to the rest of us.
The question is, normally when we talk about a high context document like biblical scripture, where the author and the audience, that raises an interesting point that we always like to say, well, the original audience and the author knew what was going on. But here's one of those things. If he's revealing a mystery, Paul didn't give us all the details. What makes us so sure that the audience could fill in the right details when he's revealing to them this insider info that was once hidden but now revealed? Like I said, he doesn't give us all that information. I'm not convinced that the original audience, at least on this point, would have had all of that information that Paul assumes behind all of this.
Okay, so just stepping back a minute and just try to get the forest a little bit here, because we're going to step into the bigger overall arching narrative and get out of the trees here, and just look at what's happening. So you've got Eden, fall, then a whole lot of mess, and Abraham is given a promise that through him everyone ever is going to be blessed. All nations, everybody, everywhere, anywhere, anytime, everybody gets blessed through Abraham.
That's Romans 4.
Right. And then, but we got to walk through. You just got to let me walk through this mentally here, because I didn't have any time to prep, because some of us have homework to do.
Yeah. I mean, when we get to 26, we're still got to talk about,
this
is my covenant with them. Okay. Which one?
Right.
Is it the covenant, the old covenant, the new covenant? Is it another new covenant at the eschaton? That this is another covenant I make? If it's a mess. And so when anyone says to me that they've got this figured out, like, okay, if you believe that this is ethnic Israel all the way through, okay, I do not see how you can have, which is why I don't. I've said I don't take that view. But even if I did, because I'm not a hard the other way guy either, because I think that the best you can say is 75% either way. Anyone saying that they're more confident than that, I want to ask them all of these other little questions to see if they can consistently get that all the way through and it not just kind of fall off in the deep end into novelty. So there's a lot here, and
Well,
So I'm sorry. Go ahead. Keep working
okay.
through in real time.
I'm thinking, yes, because so then you've got Abraham, and then you've got all of that. Jacob is the one who is given the promise, and we get Jacob being the line that's going to redeem everybody, and then they go into exile, or go into exile the first time. They end up in good grief, Egypt. Having trouble with names today. They end up in Egypt.
Yeah, we're basically doing Romans 9 again, real quick, right?
Yes, we are. Well, I mean, sure, why not? I'm doing Old Testament theology. You're doing Romans 9.
Yeah, well, so is Paul. Paul's doing Exodus or he's doing patriarchs,
Exactly.
Exodus, exile.
Right. And so you've got Ishmael and Esau, who were not, they're still family of Abraham, so they still are given blessing. They're still given promise, and they're given a role to prepare the land for when Israel gets there. Israel doesn't get very far, and then all of a sudden somebody accidentally tells Aaron to make a golden calf that he does, and gets everybody in trouble. And then they get to the promised land, and they decide, nope, don't think so. And then they go wander around while the rest of the ones who are the stubborn people die off, and the kids get to try again. And then Joshua leads them in, and God goes in front of them, and there's a whole lot of people running off, and people being brought in, and people being made and brought into Israel. There's a few places where some sacred space and some spiritual battles have to happen. So there's 3 major battles listed in Joshua. So you've got that, and God establishing his dominion over this promised land, claiming it back, reclaiming that sacred space. And that becomes God's earthly seat. And they get the tabernacle, and then David gets the bright idea to build the temple, and Solomon violates Torah while he's building the temple. And then you get a whole bunch of chaos. They didn't get out of Solomon before the kingdom splits. And you've got the north, the south, and that all goes really badly. And the prophets spend a whole lot of space wrestling with the question of who is Israel? Who are the people of God? And that, I think, is the bigger question.
Well, that's been that's the question tonight, but that is the question in the Old Testament. And if it wasn't the question in the Old Testament, Paul could have never said what he said in Romans 9:6.
Right.
That's very important.
Yes, it is, because the prophets are wrestling with the same question Paul is. Is this those who want to dwell with God, or is this ethnicity? Does being a child of Abraham make you Israel, or does the desire to dwell in community with Yahweh, does that make you Israel? So they're wrestling with the same question that we're wrestling with here. And their answer is, we got to wait, and Messiah is going to figure this out. Because one of the things that the Messiah does, so the role of Messiah, the very, very, very stripped down, basic version of the coming Messiah, is a prophet, a priest, and a king who does only what Yahweh can do. So that's the very, very base definition there. Yeah. And that's impossible. I mean, because Messiah is so obvious, because that's impossible, that they part of, I think, why the expectation got skewed, because they're looking for something that was obvious but impossible. But only what Yahweh can do. One of those things that Yahweh was supposed to do was to put everything back into its original order. So Israel's going to be reunited. And only God's going to be able to put Israel back together. So then you've got to wrestle with that question. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean ethnic Israel? Does that mean, because Israel started with one family with a whole bunch of tag-alongs, and then they just keep collecting tag-alongs through the rest of the Bible. So I'm less convinced with the ethnic argument.
Yeah. See, on the one hand, Paul just talked about the olive branches grafted into the root, and it's one tree, that obviously being a symbol for Israel. But throughout 9, 10, and 11, the question is dealing with, well, what of unbelieving or unregenerate, whatever language you want to use, outgroup ethnic Israel. And so that side is going to argue that why think that Paul means something different here that he's never meant in any other instance in this entire section. And that's going to be their pushback against, if you're leaning away from ethnic or national Israel, as opposed to Israel plus the engrafted Gentiles. Because what they will say is national Israel has always, proselytized anyway. So you could always become part of covenantal Israel, or covenantal Israel. Old covenantal Israel would be another way of saying that.
I guess
and to whom the new covenant was promised. I mean, it's kind of taken as a given for Paul that the task of election was to be a light to the Gentile nations. Now, they didn't necessarily succeed at that task, but that was always a given. That's at least what they were intended to do. So they'll say, why think Paul means something different here? Even if you want to say the Israel of God and all that in Galatians, okay, we have that, but in this context, they're going to say, Amber, that why the change here in this use of Israel, as opposed to the entire rest of the section, which he's trying to specifically deal with the outgroup Israel.
Well, partly because the prophets can't decide either. I mean, they can't. I mean, if you could just simply go through Isaiah through Malachi and highlight every time the word Israel and Judah is used and try to figure out how they're using that consistently, you're going to make yourself crazy. And it's kind of an exercise in futility because that word flops around all the time. Sometimes it's national. Sometimes it's covenantal. Sometimes it's birthrights. I mean, the prophets can't even figure that out. That's why I keep saying this is the same question that the prophets are wrestling with because they can't even make up their own minds. We get to, depending on what order you read the Old Testament, and you get to Malachi or you get to Chronicles, and they're still asking, who are the people of God? And when is he going to come get us out of this mess? Yeah. Is where we're left at the end of the Old Testament. So they're trying to answer a question that the Old Testament doesn't even answer because the Old Testament doesn't even know.
Well, whether it's Clement or from Clement, Justin, Irenaeus, some other early church fathers prior to the 5th or 6th century, and Origen and Augustine took both views at different points in their writings. So we'll set those aside. But even counting the fact that where they agreed with the earlier fathers, especially the Ante-Nicene, you could say the majority view was the Jew plus Gentile believers were Israel. Right. But then it starts to go all the way through the medievals to, no, this is probably just ethnic Israel. And then finally, if we get to like contemporary scholarship, I think the majority view of like confessional scholars, I don't know what you might say about like, I haven't glanced to what moderate or liberal scholars are thinking, but most conservative scholars, and I think a good chunk of moderates, would probably have the majority of the view would be ethnic Israel, and they would say it's ethnic Israel at the time of the eschaton. So it would be all of Israel, but the majority says all doesn't mean all without exception here. It just means all generally, even though some would be left out. At some future date, they will all receive the gospel. And so they, not very many people take this position that God is going to do something independent of Christ. They think that that's just too foreign of an idea for Paul. The argument for that, in case people are curious, though, is that part of Israel's election includes the duty they are fulfilling by being hardened. And so they are still fulfilling their elective calling. They're still playing their role faithfully in unbelief, which is, I think, patently ridiculous. And that might be a caricature of their view, but that's essentially what they're saying, is that because Israel was still playing this prominent role to bring salvation to the Gentiles, it's another one of those two-way of salvation. And that is a very minority view. So I just want to make that clear. But I also to bring it to people's attention that there is a faction of people who say, yes, ethnic Israel, and God's going to save them, including reasons why they're doing this unbelief now, because that's what they're supposed to be doing. They exist. I mean, all kinds of people write all kinds of papers and theses. That's what academia does. But I'm just saying that's out there, very minority view, but it's there. But the majority view is at the end times, when Jesus returns, all ethnic Israel that is alive at that point, more or less, not necessarily all without exception, are going to be saved, because they think saved here is definitely talking about eschatological salvation, the way Paul uses it all through Romans. So that's the majority view now. I think there is it's a sizable minority view, though. It's not like it's like just weird. It's a sizable minority that does say it's the Jew plus Gentile church, and that's going to happen. And in that view, there are those who believe that Jesus returns. So your eschatology kind of determines how you understand all this as well.
Right.
The fullness of Gentiles, if you're post-mill, that works for post-mill. The church is Israel, the true Israel, the Israel of God, whatever language you want to use. And so there's a fulfillment there. Or even if you're not, but you still want to hang on to, this is the Jew plus interpretation, it's still going to be the Jew plus Gentile church. And this is over the course of redemptive history. It's not necessarily some big final apocalyptic mass conversion at the end times. So, there's that view.
I don't know. Maybe the problem is, I don't know, because, the problem is I don't know, but I don't see, thematically a big separation between the intention of the assembly in the Old Testament and the gathering of the ecclesia in the New. I don't see those as different. I see those as a continuation that's recontextualized through Christ. I don't see a difference. So it's harder for me to weigh in on that when I don't see a distinction.
Yeah, Brother Lowe, I was going to get to this, but I forgot to get to it. Part of the argument for your view, Amber, is Paul settled this back in Romans chapter 2. Who is a Jew? Is one circumcised outwardly or one circumcised is inwardly of the heart, right?
Right.
So if Paul's talking about Gentiles are true Jews in chapter 2, why think that has slipped his mind, and why would you not allow wordplay for Paul here? Because there is a sleight of hand wordplay for all who are Israel, they are not these Israel. That's already wordplay in 9:6. So no matter what, he's already made a distinction that's not just the total sum of ethnic Israel, because there's an Israel within Israel. So if he can do that, say an Israel inside of Israel, even if he only still means ethnic Israel there, to say, and this way all Israel, the all Israel, he can do a sleight of hand here. If you want to think that the olive tree plus what he says towards the end of Romans chapter 2, all of that comes in. But the pushback on that, like if Dr. David Allen says, when did he ever, why should we why should we see that when it's not obvious of this kind of wordplay without having to jump to any sort of Israel of God and Galatians language or whatever else? I hear all that, but like I said, as we went through this in previous episodes, the fact that so many Old Testament texts, even back in Romans 9, things that did not apply to Israel, like Egypt and Pharaoh, was being pushed upon unbelieving Israel,
right,
in a shocking kind of way. And towards the ends of Romans 9, where you've got these vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy, not only from the lump of Israel, but also from the Gentiles, And so when they're coming in, and then Paul goes into the end of Romans 9, and he's channeling all of these prophetic texts that seem to apply to both. So like I said, I see the arguments on both sides. But I'm usually a little bit more flexible than I think a lot of more evangelical types. When I look back at early church fathers and think, I mean, they were not as far removed as I am.
Right.
I let them sing their song too, and I'm thinking, I'm kind of okay with allowing Paul to have shades of meaning in a word like Israel, even if it doesn't seem like that's the obvious thing. Given that I think verse 26, and then again in verse 32 before the doxology, I think this is a very climactic portion. And understanding, like rhetorically, is like when the Gentiles are now here, Israel's saved, right? Like
I think
all Israel is saved when the Gentiles have come in, and that language can work either way. I have a hard time believing, and I wish Dr. Allen could have been here because I would have asked him this question, because I know that he thinks that replacement or the Jew plus Gentile true Israel business is nonsense. What I want to ask him is, because I know he's not a Calvinist, and so I think you would need a mechanism like John MacArthur. He says he gave a lecture at one of his conferences or whatever. He said why every Calvinist should be, or every self-respecting Calvinist should be, a dispensationalist. And I know that it ruffled a lot of feathers in the Reformed community, but what he's saying makes sense. Like if you're going to have like a mass conversion of all Israel getting saved, you're going to need something like an unconditional election, an irresistible grace type of mechanism that just flips that switch on in their heads. And so I would want to ask David Allen, as a non-Calvinist, how does all Israel? I mean, just saying, well, God foreknew that this would happen if He did this, this, that, and the other. That I don't. To me, it seems like. It seems like I have to, no offense, Calvinists, I think John MacArthur's got you over a barrel if you take this ethnic Israel view, because you probably need Calvinists to make that happen. So for all you Calvinists who don't take that view, you have the same problems that all Calvinists have. But it seems like he's got a point here that idea of a mass conversion at the end times, which is what Ben Witherington, the Arminian, believes as well. I was like, well, that seems to make sense that at this final moment, God's going to flip their switch and they're going to become believers. So I think Ben Witherington has a problem that David Allen has. If you have this idea that there's going to be this mass conversion of Jews at the second coming of Jesus, that seems
I don't see that either. If you're going to claim, like, you get that the weeds I don't even want to get into. So because it goes ridiculous places that doesn't even need to be said out loud, I don't think, because it just, then you get into things like, if you're going to insist that it has to be all ethnic Israel is the mass saved just because they're ethnic Israel, then what do you do with the rebellious and unbelieving ethnic Israel? you have, then you got that whole ridiculous, we got Baal worshipers in heaven question running around.
Well,
which is
I mean,
completely ridiculous.
I'm sorry, they were born at the wrong time of human history. They needed to be born, right before Jesus showed up. I mean,
I guess the whole world should have waited for Jesus to get born. Like
well, Amber, God is sovereign, okay, and they had to do. If you're a Calvinist, they had no choice but to not ever believe like everyone else. But if you're not a Calvinist, but I mean, if you're not a Calvinist,
I don't know.
I mean, I guess they could. Well, in the literature, there's wiggle room for Alan, I guess, because they would say, well, by all Israel, it means a vast number, and it's the ones that God foreknew would convert, and blah 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 blah. I guess they could say that, but Jewett isn't having that in his commentary. Just to read, he says, however, the word "pos" means all, any, and every entity out of a totality, and thus it does not lend itself to this is why I like moderates, because they don't really care. He says, and thus it does not lend itself to the expression of exceptions. And he has he leans hard on like Calvinistic type stuff and runs away from it whenever he feels like it, because he doesn't care about, I like Jewett, he's a good scholar, but I mean, he doesn't care about being as consistent as like a more conservative scholar would be. And so he says, and thus it does not lend itself to the expression of exceptions. There is also nothing in the context that supports an interpretation of most with a few exceptions, which is, by the way, the majority view that he's pushing back on, that people think that all Israel means all Jews at the present time of Jesus' return convert. It does not support an interpretation of most with a few exceptions, quote unquote, because verse 27 goes on to argue that all of Israel's sins will be taken away, and verse 32 concludes that God will show mercy to all, which he's kind of playing it. He's a universalist. So he's playing into that kind of thing. So he's trying to boil over both Calvinists and he tries to boil over everybody. He's like, because he thinks, well, I don't know if he's personally a universalist, but he at least thinks Paul is. I'm not familiar with a lot of Jewett's work, other than I can tell he's not necessarily a conservative scholar. But I think that he's pushing back on a lot of the scholars that he's interacting with in this, whether they're conservative, moderate, liberal, whoever. And he's saying these ideas and these commentaries about some sort of, well, all just kind of means most. And he's pushing against that. That includes Reformed scholars, non-Reformed scholars, anyone who takes whether it's been Witherington or on the non-Reformed side, or David Allen, or he's talking about any of the Calvinistic scholars that in the commentaries. If you're trying to soften this all and get away from it, Jewett ain't having it. And
see, I personally, because I just can't get it past a couple of things. One, the Old Testament doesn't settle this question of who is Israel in the first place. So
it does. It's a mixed multitude of covenantal people that left Egypt.
Well, there you go. But that did,
and then all the Gentiles that were kind of
Then you got the prophets, and you got God hates Israel, God loves Israel, Israel's out, Judah's in, Judah's out, Israel's in. They're both out, they're both in. Depending on which prophet you're talking about and what thing they're doing, Israel's all over the map and nowhere at the same time. So there's I don't know. I kind of tend and if you're going to claim that you're saved through Abraham's given that promise before he is given the mark of circumcision. The mark of circumcision comes in after the whole debacle with Hagar. So, there's some things I think going on there that have some honor shame stuff that's underneath some of the not putting on the Jews the circumcision marks of shame that aren't theirs to bear. But I think I would tend to lean more with the church fathers, in the early church fathers, with this mystery that is explaining the unbelief of so many Jews, and that the Gentiles are now being united to the remnant of the faithful Jews. And together they're that body of believers that form the true Israel. Kind of an idea is more where I would kind of land ish. That Jesus Christ is that Israel of God, which is the church. The true Israel is not based on biological ancestry, but on faithfulness to God's deliverer, the Messiah. This understanding of all Israel will be saved is kind of where that summary of early church fathers, I think, kind of lands. Which I
that's
would
basically
more agree with that than anything.
Yeah, see, that's still kind of my leaning, because going back to I don't want to get it wrong. It's a commenter that I pulled up earlier, that made reference to Romans chapter 2. It's like, if you think about everything Paul does, I don't mind a slight of bit of wordplay here on Paul's part. Brother Lowe, yes, thank you. This earlier comment, going back to Romans chapter 2, the second half, it seems to me that as I've been leaning that way all the way through, you have the tree, or you have the branches grafted in, still the same tree. Somebody just made reference to this is the Romans 11 is saying what is saying the same thing as Ephesians 2, and all prophecy which states God will bring Gentiles into Israel as part of the people. Right. I mean, it seems like Ephesians chapters 1, 2, and 3 definitely are all about one new man from 2, right? Same. All of the, the inheritance, every spiritual blessing is for both. And, all that language in Ephesians, that, I'm not trying to just go to Ephesians to answer my questions about Romans 11, but it seems like if you start in Romans 2 and you follow up, it seems like in this climactic portion, I see how it's easier to get to what I would lean to, and I know people hate the term replacement, but it's just like, or if you want to call it true Israel, or the Israel of God, to use biblical language borrowed from Galatians. If you want to call it the ingrafting, whatever, I'm still more leaning that way than the other. Like I said, I'm not married to my position. I'm happy. I wish somebody could have came on to shill for the other position and fuss at you and fuss at me about it, because I'm kind of more on your side than not. So I wish we had someone else here tonight that would, set us straight. But I see, just following the logic of Romans, the fact that he was willing to make a distinction about Israel in the first part of this whole section in 9:6 makes me think that when the fullness of Gentiles comes in, this same tree the whole tree is going to be saved, with all the grafting in, breaking off, grafting back in if they repent, all of this. That seems to be like an ongoing process. And the commentaries that are more leaning towards it's always ethnic Israel seem to say, well, let's go back and see, Paul's still talking about Jewish stuff over against non-Jewish. So it seems to be ethnic or national Israel all the way through. And I'm like, yeah, but now we're just kind of forgetting what he just said. What he just said about this tree and these branches. It's like, this seems to be an ongoing process that Paul issues a warning to the Gentiles, because they could even be broken off in unbelieving Israel. They could be grafted in. This seems to be ongoing, which is why I'm also thinking that this idea of fullness or full representation, if you think corporate collectivist language, he's not meaning every single last name and number Gentile convert, but he's thinking when all the nations are represented and they're grafted back in and all of that kind of stuff, all this corporate language.
Right.
I'm thinking this ongoing process that also leads me away from some sort of second coming. Notice he hasn't mentioned Christ anywhere here specifically. So I don't really see any sort of this leading up to some eschatological second coming event. You could put that in there if you like. I mean, Paul does seem to have eschatology in mind, going back to Romans chapter 8 and the earth is released into the glorious freedom of the sons and daughters of God, all of that stuff. Yes. But I just don't, when you look at this metaphor of the olive branches and all of that, it just seems to me that this is an ongoing process, and that when Israel is all saved, when all this process is done. And I'm thinking that's going to be over the course of human history, and not necessarily some final eschatological thing.
Well, and I think too, for me, that because I don't, Paul, I find Romans tedious, but I think like one of the main themes Paul seems to in all of his letters as a general theme, going through all of them, he cares really strongly about two things. One, defense of the gospel, preservation of the message, calling out and dealing with false teachers. That's a big deal for Paul. And this other thing that he talks about a lot in all of his letters is unity. He cares about two things, the gospel and unity. So it seems weird to me to build something in here that's going to bake in disunity into a guy who's all about banging on the unity drum. So I think the whole point of this 9 through 11 section is to be like, look, here are the stuff that you guys are disunified about. And then we're going to get to this stuff that's coming in 12 to 16. And he's just going to blast them about that. And we're going to get to the point of unity. So we're going to deal with here's the stuff that's going on with the Jewish bunch of people in your church, so the Gentiles can see what he's talking about and understand their point of view. Then we're going to deal with the Gentiles and what's going on with them, and do it so that the Jewish Christians can see what's going on and understand their point of view. And he's going to smash all that together and go, look, get over yourselves. You need to be unified. So I don't see, to me, it doesn't matter as much with the question is unity.
Yeah, and a lot of people want to say, okay, now that you've reached the end of Romans 11, after this episode's over, you've done the theology part. Now we get to the practical app. But I don't think that that's a distinction in Paul's mind. So whatever you decide about this here is going to matter. What you say about what comes next, because if Paul is trying to rope in, you are all one thing, you're all one tree, one Israel. Whatever. But see, it's complicated because they're going to say, okay, well, the deliverance coming from God is going to remove all the sins from Jacob. Why is that not going back to Israel? Why is that Jacob not? Because what they'll say, Amber, is if you take that view, Paul's quotes from Isaiah 59, 20 through 21, he's dealing with unbelieving Israel's sin. So why is Israel in 26 the Jew plus Gentile church? But then he quotes Isaiah and he's talking about Jacob. Is that not national Israel, Old Testament, not non-Gentiles? So why would he go into that right after saying all Israel will be saved and start talking about Zion and Jacob and covenant and taking away their sins? Because Team Ethnic Israel is going to say that doesn't make sense with what he says right there, and how you understand this. This is my covenant with them, echoing Jeremiah 31 language, 31, 33. That I will take away their sins. That this has to be ethnic Israel, has to be a final eschatological turn for ethnic Israel at the end times, so that God didn't lie and he kept his promise, because we're going to go on to verse 29 and talk about all that. So to use the language of the internet, how do you get around verse 26b, Amber?
How do I get around verse 26b? I get around that because Paul is going to know the prophets, and Paul is going to understand that the prophets use Israel every possible way you can and invents about 4 other ways more. So Paul is going to be pulling on all of that imagery to kind of, to be like, hey, I don't, Israel, however you define that, Gentiles, I don't think that, because again, this question, I don't see that it gets answered definitively by the time you get to Malachi or Chronicles, however you want to argue that order. I don't think that question is, they're still sitting here at the end of that going, who are we? And we're waiting for the one who's supposed to come and fix this. So that's a question that Paul is going to have in his mind, and because he's pulling so many prophets that are on all sides of that argument. It isn't, it doesn't. I just can't quite, because the Old Testament, because again, the Old Testament doesn't settle this question at the end. And when we get to the Chronicles, and if you're looking at it in that order, and in Chronicles in the Tanakh order,
the John
it's
17
not,
Project says the nation of Israel in the Old Testament always included Gentiles and was never only one ethnic group. That's true, but if you all ethnic or national Israel, not Rahab though, not her, but Jacob is everyone but Rahab and Ruth. You know,
and Nahum and
right. So I mean, yeah, I mean, you have to decide what the prophets thought, and if you decide that the prophets never had a single definition of Israel, then they obviously don't have a single definition of, you know, Jacob just being a way of saying Israel. You know, somebody said, somebody had a comment, Jacob equals Israel, one who wrestles with God, and one who wrestles with God and man and overcomes equals Jesus. We overcome by believing him who overcame. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there is a tradition of conservative evangelicals in the United States that think that the Old Testament only meant one thing, and they, you know, some sort of ethnic, national thing, and which was never true when the Hebrews left with a mixed multitude and then entered into covenant. So, I mean, you know, maybe dispensationalism is to blame for not picking up and detecting all the nuance in the Old Testament. I'm not blaming them for everything. I know people wish that I would. My dad was a dispensationalist. He wasn't an evildoer, though. You know, so, but I mean, maybe that plus the fact that we live in a time where we think that the nation of Israel now gets us in our mind that they are, you know, a homogenous ethnicity, which is still not true. I've been to Israel, and it's not that either. But you know, I don't know. It's a very complicated question.
Yeah, it is. There's not a simple answer, but we also have to remember.
Yeah, and the Old Testament doesn't bail the people out that they think it does. Is what you're arguing.
And it's and Hebrew thinking, because Hebrew is very much got its own personality. The language has its own personality, and it creates space because it wants you to wrestle with these ideas, which is why it's metaphoric, why it paints things in pictures and allegory for a reason, because it's supposed to be something you wrestle with and come to the where your wisdom and your interacting and dealing with Yahweh, where that leads you. There's semantic room. So if you're going to be one of those people who that much, you know what, I'm just going to get in trouble. So I'm going to go ahead and go all the way and just get in trouble. So if you're one of those people who's going to pull out BDB or, you know, Low-NIDA or one of those and think this is the list in the lexicon is the only options you have for what that word means, you're just flat out wrong, because that's a starting place of the list of those words. The context and the way of the flow that's being used is going to change the way that works. So like if you look at Ezekiel, uses Ruach every possible way and invents 7 more just because he can. Like it's not a set, you know, it's not a set thing. So you're not stuck, you're not limited to what's in the lexicon. You've got, that's a place to start. And there's so many things that are built into that. Hebrew has so much flexibility and so much imagination because it's not, you know, it's not Greek. It's not Western thinking. We're not limited to Greek. So Hebrew, when it comes against something it hasn't got inside of its way that it thinks, and it comes across a new concept or a new idea or a new thought, it comes up with another metaphor to express that. Greek has to come up with 6 new words, 5 new tenses, and 8 ways to parse that. to understand a new term. So that's why you got Paul running around making up words all over the place, because this is something we haven't addressed yet. Hebrew's going to go, we got a metaphor for that. And Paul's like, here's 6 new pages in the lexicon. Like, that's the difference between the ways that those two think. So if you're going to be stuck and insist on just the lexicon, for Paul to have what those things he's thinking in his mind, he's Hebrew thinking, translating that into Greek. Like, he is Hebrew tradition, Hebrew thought. Whether he's writing in Hebrew or not isn't really relevant. He's thinking that way. And I'm going to get in trouble. See, I told you I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah, I see. I mean, Tarsus, Paul was a pritzy, cosmopolitan, thoroughly Hellenized dude. I mean, let's not, dude. I don't know that I buy that he can. N.T. Wright likes to say that Paul has the Greek world, the Jewish world, and the Roman world, and he has these 3 distinct little planets in his. And I'm thinking, no, what he has is he has a blob. He doesn't have a tossed salad. He has
a semantic range in his head.
Goop in his head from old Hebrew scriptures that he's probably mostly reading in Greek anyway. Probably, by the 1st century, maybe accessing easier time Greek manuscripts than Hebrew manuscripts. I think it's more jumbled in his head. Which may be why Peter says that Paul's hard to understand. So I'm
just saying it's not purely Western thought. There's
none of it's Western.
With it.
Yeah.
Well, it is from a logical.
Yeah.
Think it is because the difference between the way that ancient Near East before Greek and Rome, like. The ancient Hebrew thought differently than Greek does. It's a different point of view, and he's got at least both in his head, because he still grew up in the system, participating in the system that thinks. It might not be linguistically Hebrew, but thought-wise, it's ancient Near Eastern Hebraic thought. And it's switched over linguistically to Western thinking of the idea of logic and.
I don't think Jewish theology could be explained without the Greek language, period. I think that was a necessary addition to God's program of redemption.
Well, that's part of the key to how you transition from the Eastern mind to the Western mind.
But the Greek language and categories of thought also provided scaffolding, because if you're telling a Hebrew. If you're a Christian missionary in the 1st century and you're saying that, Jesus is seated at the right hand of God, which was said to Jewish audiences, that makes sense. You say that to Greek audiences, and they're going to say, oh, like Zeus has a right hand, Yahweh has a right hand, and Jesus is sitting right next to it. And you've gone really bad. And so if you notice, like when Paul's at the Areopagus, you don't see him talking about sitting at the right hand of God, because they don't want him to think that God has right arm. You got to have the Greek to get, because Hebrew people would know what that meant, but the Greeks would get the wrong idea. So
I'm not saying that it's not a transition piece. The Septuagint, one of the things that it did was transition from Hebrew to Greek thought. It opened it up to the rest of the world. That's how it scatters everywhere, is it transitions into Greek, because the rest of the world is Hebrew. Okay, sure, why not? But if you put it into Greek, it not only transitioned it to the lingua franca of everybody, that everybody's going to have access to forever for the rest of time, it also transitions the thinking.
Yes.
So
and to my Jewish friends, the Septuagint, largely the Greek Bible of the New Testament, written by Neoplatonists in Alexandria, for you Plato haters in the open theist camps. Anyway, Alexandrians, probably fewer heretics in the Antiochian school of interpretation, by the way. Also, another little things for all you Origen haters. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to this. To deliver God generally, Jesus, what is meant by Zion. I think God and Jesus would be a yes for Paul, talking about the soup in his head. He would not make a distinction with his high Christology here, especially given what he said in Romans 9:5. So I think that question that commentators, but the reason why they discuss it has to do with how they shake out all the other things about Israel too. So what is meant by Zion here, what you could say is, well, in Romans 9:33, Jesus was the stone laid in Zion. You can go back to Romans chapter 1 and the opening, epistolary opening where, according to the flesh, David, Romans 9:3 and 5, where he's talking about Jesus descended of them according to the flesh, but God overall blessed forever. Amen. So Zion can mean Jerusalem, but it can also just mean Jesus's descent from David, or the Jews more broadly, as Paul has already addressed at 9:5 and Romans chapter 1. So you've got that in the opening part. So Zion here doesn't have to definitely, the deliverer from Zion is the same place where the stone was put. Good call for Jesus, but it doesn't have to be exclusively a Jerusalem thing or some sort of heavenly Jerusalem. Glancing back to Jacob, but how you shake these out, the deliverer from Zion will come from Zion.
Mm-hmm.
And he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. Is that sometime, does that happen it goes back to that question, over time at the second coming, what covenant to taking away their sins? Well, you have covenant, all this new language in Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, all of that,
Yep.
Some people would posit, no, this is God independent of Jesus fulfilling his promise. That minority view even say, no, this covenant with them is that sometime in the future, I will finally make good on all these promises. And that's why he's going to save Jews from past, present, and future. That's a weird minority fringe view, but I just thought I'd mention it again. That's why that this whole other final future new covenant thing is what some people will argue that, God's going to forgive all Jews in Hades and all the ones that are alive because they did good. That very fringe minority view, but I came across it, so I thought I'd mention it. But I am so far thinking the deliverer is God, including Jesus, of course, because Jesus is God for. I'm fine. That's a both and for me. Coming from Zion, he's done that. That was the stone that Paul talked about, and this happens over time, and it's the Gentile people, and when the fullness comes in, that's how all Israel is saved, and that's why he has mercy on all. Well, we'll get to that verse in a minute. So I'm still leaning where I've always been leaning, even before tonight. And I think I don't know at which point you agree and disagree within the Jew plus Gentile thing about Zion, deliverer, when this is taking place, etc. So
I think it's all Day of the Lord imagery, and I stay out of eschatology debates other than just Old Testament Day of the Lord, and I just stay out of those, because eschatology is a dumpster fire that I don't even want to get into. So I just don't go there and even express my opinion on any of that, because I just don't.
I do think that if you take the view that I have, which is this is the Jew plus Gentile church is how they'll all be saved as the fullness comes in, and that this happens over time. That's easier for, I think that our view eschatology wise is probably better for amill or post mill than it would be pre-mill. But somebody could correct me on that. And I think that view is a lot easier for non-Calvinists as well. I think John MacArthur is right. If you're going to be a Calvinist, you need to understand this the way he does in the dispensational sense. So I know my Calvinist friends who are not, the post-mill Theo bros, and the church Israel, same thing, the ecclesia and the Septuagint, all the same assembly, all that. Those guys got big mad at John, not like seriously big mad, but they were like, no, sir. But I think John MacArthur has you guys on that. If you're going to take the Calvinism soteriology, you need that, and you need to take the rest of this on board as well. And I mean, which I would throw, that's the easier way to understand it than even like Dr. Allen or Ben Witherington would. Because how else do you get that mass conversion at the end unless it's kind of this pre-faith regeneration on switch for them? So
I'm just looking at
so mine were everyone in the chat seems sure they have all the answers and printed it over. Well, yeah, I mean, see, here's the thing. I like to talk about all this stuff without having to plant a flag. I've said where I've leaned. I disagree with people that are way smarter than me. I think Dr. Allen is a lot smarter than I am, but I know that he would say you're leaning the wrong way. He'd say both of us are leaning the wrong way. That's fine. I don't get mad about that. I don't mind being convinced. And like I said, I wish that we could have got a proponent of that view to represent them more fully than I'm just trying to give you all the bases. But I always tell people what I think, and what I think is what I've been saying. I've thought I lean towards the Jew plus Gentile. I think this is something that happens over time. I don't see necessarily some big end time event in view here. I see Paul talking about what's happening in the present and the role of outgroup Israel, how Gentiles should think about them, and how they should think about themselves as part of the same tree as the remnant. And speaking of remnant, some people think that when it comes to the Jew plus Gentile church, it's talking about a remnant of Jews and only a remnant of Gentiles. So there's not going to be like, they think this is remnant language all the way through. So like Gentile believers are also remnant. So just wanted to point that out as well. So that's kind of where I'm at on all of these choices about what is Israel, who's the deliverer, what is Zion, what's meant by Jacob, what covenant. We're talking about the new covenant, and what does Paul mean by the Israel being saved? Take away their sins. That's like believe in Jesus and sins are forgiven stuff. That's what he means by all of that. But those are all questions in the commentaries about every single one of that. And so you kind of have to make choices about that. And that's where I'm at.
Yep. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm looking at Michael Bird's commentary here, and he comes down on the side of ethnic Israel.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough.
Which is interesting to me because he does the New Testament theology book, the New Testament survey book with N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright doesn't agree with that position.
Yeah.
He says he used to in his commentary, but then he changed. But then again, he could have changed his mind since. So he wrote that commentary.
He makes an interesting. I don't know. It's the I don't know what the date on this one is, but he says, yet Paul does not seem to know of a mass conversion of Jews to the Christian faith as some kind of catalyst for the second coming, as maintained in some dispensational readings of Revelation. Even so, there's definitely a future horizon to his thought. So that's kind of, an interesting tidbit for a second there. But
I don't have Michael
I'm
Bird's
unconvinced.
Commentary. I do have N.T. Wright's commentary, and he agrees with us more or less. So
this is 2016. This is The Story of God Bible Commentary, Romans by Michael Bird, Shrimper, Longman, and Scott McKnight.
They're editors. Did the whole
yeah. Longman and not McKnight are the editors on that, but Michael Bird.
I don't have that one. That's one of the maybe 300 out of the 10 billion commentaries on Romans. I don't have. There's too many. There's just way too many.
There are. I don't like commentaries anyway, but
really, I like them. They're helpful.
Pretty much.
I like the good ones. I like to get a mix. And I'm telling you, folks out there, if you're don't be squishy about moderates or liberals. Read what they say. Sometimes they have interesting insights that you can accept without accepting their general positions and all of that. It's worth reading. Like I read moderates, I read liberal scholars because I want to see what they're saying. If for no other reason, you want to see what they're saying to counter it if it ever comes up. I know that Trinity Radio is more of an apologetics channel, so you have to do apologetics about theology and exegesis and the Bible too. It's not all kalam arguments. So you got to read that stuff, and believe it or not, you do find interesting insights in them that I think are helpful. Or you just find people who are trying to dump on everybody like Jewett is, because I don't know, he's shilling for his universalist views, but whatever. Let's get to verse 28 because we spent.
Yes, that's where to get more interesting stuff the further we go. So,
well, in relation to the gospel, they are enemies on your account. This is kind of back to the language of this is what God is doing with unbelieving Israel right now. You know, they are enemies, but because this is kind of restatement, which gets us back into, is this section how you break it up into chiastic structures, which we've talked about? Because it's kind of going back to, but it's really playing back on themes of God has a purpose in their unbelief. It's to provoke them to jealousy. You guys can get grafted in, all of that. So this is kind of restating that. And here you have a mini chiasm. You would say 28 and 31, and then 29 and 30 kind of minimum. So in relation to the gospel, they are enemies, but in relation to God's election or choice, they are beloved on account of who? The fathers, which is why I would think that the covenant, you could say, is the new covenant, but the new covenant is to simply fulfill the promise to Abraham, right? Light of Israel's failure. So, yeah, it's Yahweh on the move with that. And what I like here, and I know this is going to sound so impious because like conservative people don't say this, but he loves them not on account of them. Like he says he loves, right. It's on account of their fathers, right? I mean that's kind of a backhanded thing. They are beloved on account of not them, but the fathers. That's don't gloss over that and say like, no, God says I don't love them for them. I love them on account they're beloved because of the fathers. Just wanted to point that out. Some people could just let that just slip by and not pay attention. Oh, well, that's what's the implication there? He's saying he loves them, but it's good. They are beloved. He says they are loved, but not because of them. They're loved because of the Father. So I think that's interesting. And then we get to verse 29. And this is the language of regret here, or it's translated irrevocable, right? But the language here is really like a literal translation is regret not, the God's calling and gifts. So it's like, it's like they're still loved, and whatever this, this calling and election, this gift and calling is given without regret. Like God doesn't regret. He's not, which is interesting because and I know the open theists love to harp on the God changes his mind verses or whatever, which whatever you think what you like. I don't, unlike others, I don't panic about open theism. To me is no big deal. I'm with Steve Gregg. I'm not one, but whatever. But because that language is there, however you try to smooth it out with anthropomorphism or whatever, it's kind of interesting that Paul has to say this kind of thing, is that it's without regret, because it seems like if you read the Old Testament, God had some regrets, like making Saul king or creating humans, all kinds of things. So it's like, he's like, God did this without regret. So whatever you think it looks like with the majority of Jewish people not accepting the Messiah that God sent to them first, he had no regrets about the gifts and calling. And God is going to keep his promises that he's not, regretting or revoking or whatever, in some shape, form, or fashion that we talked about for the first hour and 20 minutes.
Right.
However you check it out, this is a cement that God's still going to do it despite it looking like this might be yet another thing that he regrets making, like people, or making Saul king, or not, wiping out everyone at Sinai, or all kinds of different things that the Old Testament kind of hints us about God's reaction to disobedience from Jewish people.
Well, yeah, we'll re-adjudicate that case again, but
yeah.
I can't, from here, I just can't get away from two things. You got shuv, turn and return. God is constantly calling, turn, return, come back to me and I will redeem you. And hesed, that we translate, long-standing, suffering, loving, long, steadfast love. That word takes 20 minutes to explain on a good day. And it just, to me, the good lovingness of God is constantly calling everyone to come back to him. So ultimately, that's Paul's point. Shuv, because the hesedness of God is waiting for you. Yeah. So however you want to take that, there you go.
Well, that's a general disposition. So yeah, Paul's pretty much, seems to me, he's trying to assure his audience, look, whatever it looks like, these people are still loved, because he goes on, calling and gifts are irrevocable or given without regret. Not going to change his mind on that.
Yeah.
And then it's the same language, kind of repeating what we talked about the last episode. For just as you were once disobedient, probably in reference to the Gentiles again, but now I've been shown mercy because of what God's doing with this partial hardening or whatever, to provoke them for jealousy, so that whatever opens the door for the Gentiles to be grafted in, all of that. You may now be shown mercy, so these now that have been disobedient, and because of the mercy shown to you, they may now be shown mercy. Which, this kind of immediacy language goes back to why I'm saying this is because it's ongoing and not like some final eschatological event of finally the mercy at the end of the world for Jews and Gentiles. Because it's like, so while this is happening, so these now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy you've shown, which is supposed to provoke the jealousy, if you remember earlier, to you, they may now be shown mercy, for God has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may have mercy to all. So there's an immediacy here that Jews and Gentiles, everyone shut up unto disobedience, and it all is so that God, and this is where Jewish universalism comes through. Because if he wants mercies all of them, they're all going to convert to Christianity, which is all without exception leads into universalism, which I think no, because I actually, Calvinists, listen. I know you're the ones that are still hanging around. I'm with you. Every time a non-Calvinist says all always means all without, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It's like, I ate all the Cheetos. Well, wait a minute. There's still 2 in the bag. You know what I meant. It's not all. So if you're a non-Calvinist, don't. That's the Norman Geisler thing. God have, rest his soul and rest in peace, whatever. I don't do that. I don't even think Leighton Flowers does that. He might have, like 10 years ago. I don't think he does that anymore. I'm happy with all. All can mean all without distinction. It can mean all without exception. It can mean all without distinction, including all without exception. Context is going to determine that. But I think because Paul, for justification, for salvation, all throughout Romans, it requires faith in Christ. And it doesn't necessarily mean, because he's talking about people groups in a more collectivist culture, in a corporate sense, it doesn't have to be all without exception. So I'm not with Jew it on that. So universalism, this does not imply universalism any more than when we talked about universalism back in Romans chapter 5, 12 through 21. That's not my view. There are certain forms of universalism that I vehemently reject. There are some that I have a little bit of patience for. That, like evangelical universalism, I have a little bit of patience for you guys. I don't throw you out of the kingdom, I heretic, but you're just wrong. Anyway, so I'm not on board with that. But I think what Paul's trying to say here in general is that the purpose of God in the disobedience of both is he is God over all, blessed forever. Amen. He is not just the God of the Jews only. He's not just the God of the Gentiles only. He's the God of all.
Right.
All have been disobedient, for all sin and fall short of the word of God. And he's going to consign them all to disobedience because they're all sinners, and he's going to have mercy on all of them through Jesus Christ. And so repent and believe the gospel.
Basically, I can get on board with that.
Yeah, that's what I think. So then we get into Paul's first doxology, because he doesn't know how to end this letter ever, because it goes on for another.
Pritchett, I'm going to graduate before we finish the book of Romans.
I hear you.
And I got another year to go.
Yeah. So he goes into this doxology. Right smack dab in the middle of it, he starts channeling this language from Job and Isaiah. But I think the rest of the stanzas of this doxology, I think I'm with the commentators that Paul came up with this all on his own. It's not like some sort of prefab doxology he's trying to shoehorn in here. I think this is him riffing with the mind of these, playing on these ideas that he has from the language of Isaiah and the language of Job, the wisdom literature, which he's shoehorning in there. Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. He sees, the riches of his mercy, the riches of his grace, the riches of this, riches of that. Paul, this is esteemed language. This is glorifying language. This is honorific language he's giving to God here. This next part of verse 33, how unsearchable are his judgment and unfathomable are his ways. People sometimes go overboard with this. It's kind of that same kind of language as God's thoughts are not our thoughts. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. We'll get into all that. What Paul's saying here is not that God is some incomprehensible gibberish thinker, that it's just like unfathomable means incomprehensibly nonsensical. But sometimes when you try to pay God too many metaphysical compliments, that's what you come off sounding like in your attempts to sound pious. Because what Paul is saying here is not that we have not known the mind of God doesn't mean that he can't make known his mind, right? Right. There are certain things that we will never understand, but there are things that are possible to understand. So don't think that unfathomable means like totally no way of knowing, because Paul just kind of explained to us what God's judgments are about all this. So what I think what's going on here is when he's saying how unsearchable is, we couldn't have predicted this, is what I think he's saying. How unsearchable are his judgments. We didn't see this coming. We didn't see this mystery coming until he revealed it. But the fact that he revealed it, and we can maybe, like you said earlier, Paul knows what he meant, but God knows that we don't.
Yeah. And I think I also see an echo here of Torah, which part of what Torah is doing is you are human and not God, and God is God. So it emphasizes that we are very much not God, and God very much is God. So I think we just don't have to go any further than that.
Right. It's saying, but I mean, I think the language here is intentional, that we couldn't have fathomed that. This is not something we would have drawn up. If we're trying to understand how God is working through Israel and through the Gentiles who are coming to faith through Israel's Messiah that Israel is missing out on. That God is planned, and it was a mystery. It's now revealed. This is what's going on, and we would have never thought of it. It's unfathomable to us. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor? Well, I mean, that's a rhetorical question. The implied answer is no one.
Nobody. Right.
Nobody
Nobody
could do
saw
that.
this coming but God. Yep. I don't think we don't need to get crazier with it than that.
Right. If you go to Isaiah chapter 40, this language, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has informed him? No one. With whom did he consult and give him understanding? No one. And who taught, it goes on and on like this. The nations are like a drop in the bucket and regarded as a speck of dust on scales. He's trying to separate the difference between God and man here, and how man doesn't get it. It's the same thing. God's answer to Job. I can't even begin to explain, Job. Don't worry about it. You'll never understand. There are some things, the secret things belong to the Lord, but that doesn't mean that God, it doesn't make sense in his mind. It's not like it's incomprehensible. It's just that we don't know. But what we do know is intelligible and we can understand it. This passage a little bit more complicated than others, I think. Romans 9 is not the labyrinth that Arminius thought it was, or Calvin, or whoever. Those people thinking that Romans 9 is the most complicated debate. I think this little section right here, 25 through 28 or 27, I think this is the most complicated part of Romans. Romans 9 is easy and Calvinists get it wrong. But I think this little section is probably the hard to understand stuff that Peter was talking about, because for all of you who think it's just ethnic Israel, it's not that simple. But I do think that our side has its own challenges as well. But obviously we have our biases and our leanings. But I think that it's very complicated, because look at this PowerPoint. You have all this stuff to sort out. And so, but Paul's closing is God's in control. You can't fathom this. You would have never seen this coming. He's not going to listen to how we think it should be done. We can't counsel him, but he has revealed this program and what's happening right now to Paul, that he's communicating this insider language and saying, we'd have never known this. This is just
right.
God.
I think it's just a reminder that, that now it's pretty common. Most Hebrew scholars that I've read, have come to where it's the translation of Yahweh really is best expressed as God says, I will show up how I show up. And this Paul is just kind of reminding us, God's going to show up how God's going to show up.
Yeah. And this language of Job reminds us, this is why I think Paul heads this section off with the riches.
Yep.
Which is language that he uses before, the depth of riches, which in the ancient world, you would say a pile of gold or coins or whatever. And the higher the pile, deeper down it is, and so that's where that kind of imagery comes from.
I think that's covenant fulfillment, the blessing, overflowing blessing of covenant fulfillment is what I think that is.
Right. Well, riches is money talk. Wealth. Maybe
in the New Testament. Wealth. But yeah.
The imagery is saying that like a big pile of money, how deep it can go. That's same with God's wisdom and knowledge. And so this language from Job about the first given to him, that it would be paid back to him. It's like he's got all of these riches. This is all from him, what he's about to say in the next verse, but this idea that it would ever be paid back. If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Right. Or what does he receive from you? Nothing. Right. That's Job 35:7, Job 41:11. Similar theme here. Who has been first to give to me that I should repay him? Right.
Right.
So that's kind of that language that there's nothing. This is all top down business. This is not bottom up business. There's nothing for us that we could ever, do for him. That's an impossibility that can't happen. And leads us to verse 36. Why is that? Because it's from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. those riches, all of this wisdom, knowledge, salvation, deliverance, usurping disobedience for purposes of mercy. God is in control of all that. Dare I say sovereign over all of that, because that's not a Calvinist. And we should praise God for that. I mean, he breaks out in the doxology because he sees the hand of God in all of that's happening. And so, yeah. And by the way, this for him, through him, and by him for Paul are all things. That's cosmic creation language. You know, you think of Colossians
of everything.
Yeah, this is cosmic. Like everything is for his glory, so to him be the glory. And if you actually care about the mercy of God, wherever you are on the theological spectrum of anything, that should make up to sing out in praise as well. So I understand why, even though at the end of his letter he's going to go on forever, he has to burst into song, because this is actually still good news, which is what he wants to take to Spain. So he needs to get these people to see that Jew and Gentile and even outgroup Jew all have a role in God's plan for the gospel to go out to Spain. So give Paul money. Don't forget about that part. That's what Romans is about. But yeah, you break out into song over how awesome God is.
Basically.
Yeah. So that brings us to the end of the chapter.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. Now we get in.
The good stuff is coming. We got Leviticus next all day. This is good stuff.
Yeah. I love how verse 12, therefore,
therefore,
all that.
Therefore, now we get to figure out what. This is the good stuff, because we get into sacrifices and the Leviticus and what all that means.
Present your bodies as
Yep.
Good as stuff. The holy sacrifice. Is the good stuff. By the mercies of God, he's still on mercy.
Yep, because mercy is important.
Yeah, that's right.
See, we need, Will's got to be here next week so he can talk about all this, why this
Church
is
not.
Pastor.
See, that's the thing, though. That's what I love Will, and the practical application stuff is important, but never stop thinking that there's a part of this letter that is not theological.
Yeah,
because that first sentence about presenting your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice is theology. It's biblical, canonical spanning theology. It's both. So, I mean, you can't get away from it. That's biblical theology. It's not just practical application part of Paul. That's all theology. You can say, that's sanctification. We have that section in systematic theology that's shorter than every other section when it should be the longest, given the way Christians behave, especially in the time of the era. But I know it's sanctification, but everyone thinks that that in practice anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out here.
Yay!
I'll close us out with what is this passage inform us about our status of Christ? Well, if you're in Christ, you're going to be used by God, and whether you think it or not, your blessings that you receive is part of God's program, even for the sake of the non-elect Israel, for one thing. How do we fit into that? Well, God knows. I don't. But that seems to be Paul's thing. And even if you hold out to some second coming thing, that hasn't happened yet. So this is still true anyway, because Paul still, the apostle to the Gentiles still ran into the synagogues first most of the time. So our status in Christ is that we are always in God's purposes program at any stage in human history, because I see this as ongoing anyway. That makes a lot more sense. Which means our vocation in Christ needs to be one of witness of the gospel and consistent living out the gospel. That's what it tells me about our vocation. What does it teach theologically about being in Christ? Theologically, what we see here is we see that despite all appearances, we see God is still trying to mercy the world, right? And we need to live out the mercy we've received, because God has shut up all in the disobedience for a purpose of mercy. The program of redemption is a program of mercy, right? Yes, there's wrath. Yes, there's final punishment. There's all of that. But Paul's focus here is on something that we should never lose focus of, and that's disobedience is for the purpose of mercy too, right? God shut everyone up with disobedience because he's not going to overlook sin, but he wants to have mercy. So think about the theology of mercy, and think about that when you're witnessing. Got to have the bad news to get to the good news. The good news is, I think, if people in our day care about justice, right? They want to see things set to right. It's a way to present the gospel to them, where what an older generation of evangelists would say is the bad news is also actually good news. Yes, there are bad things in this world, and thank God that God is going to set it all to right. The problem is we've contributed to all of the bad things in the world, and the good news is we're shut up in that so that God can have mercy.
Yep.
Our contributions to the evil of the world and the wickedness that God has to set to right can apply to you too. You can be part of that set rightness. So think about mercy, even when you're talking about sin, if you're sharing the gospel with lost people. And of course, what this offers us with respect to apologetics, as the apologist, I don't care what position you take on the question of tonight's episode about what is or isn't Israel. I still believe that we have to defend God for failed prophecies, for failed promises, because that's one of the charges against it from secularists, right? That why, if all these things that were said in the Old Testament, why are they still not concluded yet? And I would say, in response, is they are being concluded. Because one of the things that I think if you're going to critique prophecy as failed is you have to do an internal critique. But an internal critique requires you to put on the clothes of a Christian and think Christianly. And one of the things we don't talk about enough is, except at our church where they talk about it in so many different ways, because eschatology is all over the place depending on who's teaching. The world has been ending for 2,000 years now, right? Yep. Soon is obviously relative. Paul thought that he would be alive when he was writing to Thessalonica, but then changed his mind writing to Timothy and figured he wasn't going to be around anymore. So we got to stay flexible on this end times business. So no matter what your eschatology is, we see the fulfillment of God's promises ongoingly. So if you take my kind of perspective, I don't have to go all in on the John MacArthur thing and say, well, this nation in the Middle East called Israel is somehow connected to the Old Testament Israel, which whatever you make about that, I don't, whatever. I don't have to even go there because there are Jewish people who are converting to Christianity now in Israel, in America, wherever. So we see God's fulfillment in the way that God wants to fulfill his promises from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And if you answer the question the way we do, the ongoing success of the church itself is carrying out the fulfilled promises. And so whether you're an all-mill or post-mill or pre-mill, whatever, that's still true for all of us. So that's what it has to say, that God is now fulfilling all of his promises to Abraham, because we see the church all over the world and see it continue to go out and do what the church is called to do, which is to preach the gospel to the nations. So there you go. And then next time we'll get into Romans chapter 12.
Get some good stuff next time.
Yeah, the good stuff.
That's right.
Talking about sacrificing your bodies.
Right.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Guess what? We came in 9 minutes under 2 hours with the two of us, so we didn't do much better than cutting out.
No. But
do y'all have
Saturday,
on the
I got a lot of stuff on it. We got the Faith Unaltered. We've got Hebrew Bible breakdown. This next week, we're going to wade into the swamp of historical, critical versus canonical narrative methodology, and which of those is my favorite and which of them is wrong. And
the cool stuff.
Get into the cool stuff.
You got to subscribe to channels like Faith Unaltered where they talk about all the cool topics you don't get on all the other channels.
That's right. And then on Saturday, Pritchett, you have got to come by and say hi. I'll send you the link. I hit 300 today, and so we're going to have a little Old Testament Q&A, celebration party because I hit 300 on my channel called Steve. That's Saturday. Yeah. So I sent you a message which you probably ignored, and then I'll send you the link.
I'm never in my office, and so if I pop in, it might be on my cell phone and with bad audio quality and chickens in the background.
That's okay. We have kids show up all the time, so I don't care about chickens. But
and in case you missed it, you did a show with Leighton Flowers since last time we were here.
Did that? Yes, I started that morning before that show. I had 191 subscribers, and as of 10 minutes ago, I'm at 301. So my channel's just gone crazy, and we had a blast. And
thought that he would be interested in that. Leighton Flowers would be interested in anything in the Old Testament.
I gotta, what I really want to do, Pritchett, I think, is I want to grab some of you guys, and give you the same assignment of, homework that I gave Leighton, and say, I want you to read it in the Tanakh order, and then we'll sit down and you guys can all talk about whether you learned something or that's just dumb or whatever. But I think it'd be fun to get a few of you to do that, and then we can just,
I like homework. I like assigning homework.
Okay, I'm giving you some homework, Pritchett. Read the Old Testament in the Tanakh order. I'll send you the one that I want you to use.
Okay, well, I'm a slow Bible reader, but I will check that out. Our last video that we did, our Trinity Radio Live, go check that out if you haven't seen it. That was a banger episode. We had Leighton with us. The 20 questions for Calvinism, we've started to see people make response videos, so we do intend on having our responses to those responses soon. You have a better shot, Calvinists, of getting us to respond to your responses if the shorter your response videos are, because I saw some that were like over 3 hours, and I'm like, I'm not watching all that. So but we are going to have those come out, and then we've got some other. Braxton and I are going to start making sure we Trinity Radio Live on Fridays again, weekly, been consistent. This is our catalog. I mean, we have the holidays, and then the catalog for the new year is always released annually at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, which if you're ever thinking about going to seminary, go to trinitysem.edu and fill out an eval. Comes out on January 31st every year. And so I've been wrapped up with that, with the new programs and all of that stuff. A lot of good stuff coming up here at the seminary. Still enrolling and growing, whereas a lot of seminaries around the country and world are shrinking and closing. So get in on all of the fun at a seminary you can afford with professors you actually have heard of before. So trinitysem.edu, and by contractual obligation, Braxton says our money is down. And I still, he got a new camera. Thank you, Chris Harris, for your recent contributions to help that in. I still have this junky one where I look like I'm a YouTuber from 2007. So Trinity, the seminary, you don't get rich working at Trinity. So if you want to go to patreon.com/Trinity Radio and chip in $5, I promise I won't use it for booze and cigarette. No, I'm just kidding. I don't. Cigarettes are stupid. I'll use it maybe for a haircut, but I also need to save up for a new camera. So trinitysim.edu for the seminary and patreon.com/Trinity Radio for the Patreon. Please help get me a new camera so that I look as good as Braxton does. I'd appreciate it. And with that, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.